Good morning. We're so happy to see you all here. Thank you all for coming. We are thrilled at CAM to be able to host Trenton Doyle Hancock and his exhibition here that you can see in Gallery C that is also accompanied with this wonderful piece that's hanging behind us that we'll probably talk a little bit about today. So what we wanted to do for today's format was to really have a kind of conversation, a relaxed, informal conversation between Trenton and I. And then we've deliberately set aside about 15 to 20 minutes at the end, so it's not really the end, I guess halfway through, for us to be able to then open it up so that we can have a conversation with you all, so that it's not just a conversation between us, but it's a conversation between all of us. So I say that just to kind of put it out there so you can start thinking as we're talking. If there are any questions or thoughts or ideas that you would like to pose into a question halfway through our conversation this morning. So I thought I would start first with just a little biographical information about Trenton and his practice, and then we'll jump right on in. So Trenton Doyle Hancock was featured in the 2000 and 2002 Whitney Biennial exhibitions, becoming one of the youngest artists in history to participate in this very prestigious survey. His work has been the subject of one-person exhibitions at the University of South Florida Contemporary Art Museum, the Savannah College of Art and Design, the Weatherspoon Museum, the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth, Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh, and many, many other exhibitions. His work is also included in a number of very prestigious museum collections, both in the US and abroad, including MoMA in New York, the Whitney, the Met, the Studio Museum in Harlem, SF MoMA, among many others. And in 2017, Trenton was awarded the Texas Artist of the Year by the Art League Houston. Trenton earned his BFA from Texas A&M University and his MFA from Tyler School of Art at Temple University. What's really interesting about the exhibition here is that we have examples of his work from both his BFA show and his MFA show, which is really exciting. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Trenton's practice, his work is part fictional, part autobiographical. He pulls from his own personal experience, art historical canon, comic books, superheroes, films, pop culture, all resulting in a complex fusion of characters and plots that possess universal ideas of good and evil, light and dark, and all the kind of gray in between. At the center of Trenton's storytelling is an imaginative and epic narrative about fictional creatures called the Mounds. So I thought that was kind of a good place for us to start this morning. With the creation story, maybe, of the Mounds. Turn it over to you.
Okay. First off, I want to say thank you, Wassan, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out this morning. And thank you, CAM St. Louis, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. The Mound, I guess the idea of Mound for me began when I was an undergraduate. I really was invested in this idea of finding the self or some sort of a truth through graphic expression. Basically, I just wanted to be a painter. I wanted to make images. And you know, as a kid, I didn't understand really what that meant. I knew you could make comic books, and that was a way that you could propel your ideas forth. But the painting thing was a bit stranger. I didn't understand the art world or any of that at that point. But drawing the figure was a way for me to sort of test some of the boundaries on my own terms, in terms of what I thought, what is the figure? What does it mean to me? How does that relate to my own proportions and that type of thing? So what I began to do was think about things in terms of how they're essential. Like, what do we actually need to live? And so I'm making these figures, and I pluck the arms off of them. Quite literally, sometimes I just sliced that right off of the drawing, plucked the legs off. And what was left were these bowling pin forms. And I start using those more and more in the work. At the time, it just felt very exciting. So I'm like, oh, I'm really developing something that's mine. Like I feel this kinship to these weird forms. And it was around that time that a professor of mine asked me a question, which was at the same time just, matter of fact, innocent question, and also one that really was the door that opened to the second half of my academic learning. Was what do you feel it means to be a black artist? And I was 22. I'd never, ever, ever thought about that, ever. No one had ever asked me that. And I thought, oh, I am black, aren't I? And I don't know what that really means in terms of art making. So, I start reading up on some cultural theory. That's when I was introduced to James Baldwin's writing, and really thinking about, okay, there's a certain way I see myself, but then there's all of these other eyes that are on me that are also constructing my identity. So that's when I started thinking about this idea of the oscillation between the blackness and the whiteness. So that's where the stripes really did come from, and my love of words and play on words and this kind of double and triple meaning sometimes. This, I was thinking of racial stereotypes, coon, zebra, this issue of institutional incarceration, the stripes, the prison stripes, and okay, I was like, what does all of this mean to me? Some of it in a one-to-one way didn't really hold a lot of meaning, but I thought if I'm the ambassador in some way because of my skin tone, there's these things that the work is going to take on, and there's issues that I'm going to take on regardless of whether I want to or not. So those things started to enter into the work. So basically the stripes made their way onto those bowling pin forms, and so there is this sort of covert or overt, if you will, meaning, like political meaning, like inside the mounds. Mm-hmm. But I think I quickly realized that I wasn't a politician and I wasn't really interested in being an ambassador in that way. And I was certainly more interested in fantastical ideas, like ideas that stretched past the boundaries of earthly concerns even. Mm-hmm. So, I think that put me at that time in line with some, Afrofuturists and whatnot. Like, that's when I learned about Sun Ra and started thinking more deeply about Parliament Funkadelic and that type of things. Like through the music, through the poetry, through some other type of performative or graphic expression, you could assert yourself and basically create the kind of world that you want to inhabit, or at the very least create a community for yourself. Like if you create it, the people that are closest to you, no matter what time period it might be from, they come to you. So characters that are throughout history, like, I don't know, say James Ensor even, or some of the more rough and tumble painters and thinkers of our time, I started to think, oh, those are part of my community. And then, of course, people that were living that I could have conversations with. But, and case in point here, I have this show and this great opportunity, and then people come and I find out, oh, there's a community, there's a group of people that are thinking about similar things, or they're curious. So, but I think as an artist, you have to figure it out on your own terms, how that community, like what kind of community you want to be part of, and never let other people dictate because of just some superficiality. It's like, well, you're you're a woman, so you have to be part of this group here, or you're black, so you have to be, always mentioned in concert with these people here. It's much stranger than that. So I think early on I realized that I was really interested in a very strange kind of, strange activity. I don't know.
Well, so I'll maybe pick up on one thing you sort of just said, which is, thinking about the kind of communities that might gather around or be engaged in your work. And I think that there's an interesting way in which you work in so many different mediums, and the Moundverse universe that you've created has lots of different types of outputs. And we talked a little bit about this, I know you and I, that there's both kind of some of the work that feels like it might lend itself easier to a white gallery kind of space. And then there's other work that maybe like the sculpture or the figurines that you're working on producing, where those are really about a kind of different audience. This is a kind of maybe an audience that is really excited about the influences in superheroes and comic books and films and things like that in your work. I think it's interesting that you're sort of able to have a foot in both of these spaces. And I think for the show at CAM, we were trying to kind of find a way to maybe narrow that space. How do you feel about this sort of relationship between these different kind of audiences through the work? Or is it maybe something you don't really think, well, you think about it because you just, you just said you did,
I believe in the democracy of art. I think it's an expression that's for everybody, and it is projected from everyone, even if you do gestures, you make gestures every day that are artful, that are poetic, and those things are built into how we move through space and how we understand growth. So art is just, I feel like it's something for everyone, and I think that's one of the unique aspects of CAM here is that it seems that the community is invited in, and there's programming that's built into the institution to have multiple voices, represented and shown, and the fact that people can come in here for free and hear talks and see work, and I mean that's an amazing thing. So I think it's just something that is part of me. I didn't set out to say, well, I'm gonna fight for the people. I want to make art that it turned into that, but it's just something natural for me that I understand that early on I loved art of all levels. I mean, there wasn't a museum in Paris, Texas that I could go to and see, master paintings, but we did have an encyclopedia at our home, in the house. And I loved, as a little kid, grab the P encyclopedia and thumb right to the paintings. And I just go through there and say, oh, wow, look at, someone made these things. And some of them are really scary to look at, and some of this is, kind of beautiful. But I was just riding on pure feeling and the understanding that there are people out there that operate that way. So I think the art history never scared me. Like, it never was this threatening kind of bully thing, because I always felt this kinship to it, even seeing little thumbnails of the work. And of course, at the same time, I'm looking at comic books and Garbage Pail Kids, as you see here. Other things that people would consider low art. But I mean, when you really break it down, there's some of the most amazing artisans and artists and thinkers are working in what you would call, or what has been called, low art, and that to me is a disservice to those forms. And in my own way, I'm trying to bridge the gap of understanding and appreciation of what is considered high and low. And and yeah, hopefully, and I don't always know when I'm making those moves. Sometimes I have to step back from a painting or whatever it is that I created and say, oh, I can kind of start to break down where the sophistication is here and where there's different types of sophistication, and I like kind of exploring all of that within my own hand, and so.
One of the things I think is really interesting that you shared with me or with us a couple days ago is that you have a really good memory of your childhood. Like, you told me a story that you remember crawling around the house. And I think that what's so interesting is how your memories, to kind of go back to what you were saying at the beginning about the sort of search for truth, your memories and your personal kind of childhood experiences have really become a way that you have sort of tapped into what you're calling kind of this truth. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, when you also said, like, you know, one time when you were a kid, you like put your food in a big mound pile on your plate, you know, that the sort of form of the mound has always kind of been in your life in some way. How do you kind of log in and out of these sort of moments, and how do they kind of push your practice?
Well, I think I like the idea of logging in and out of it. That's I like that. I don't. It's hard to separate it now, really, like, because the work, especially currently, has so much to do with me going back and being in that headspace that I'm kind of always there. I'm always somewhere between 3 and 15 years old at any given point. And that's, I guess I've afforded myself the space to be there, thankfully. But I think that the first time I started really thinking about childhood, your childhood as this space of truth was, perhaps I was 20 or 21, a point at which I felt I had started the emancipation process from my hometown of Paris, Texas, and to really understand, okay, there's some behaviors and expectations in rural Northeast Texas that are very different and in some ways antithetical to what I wanted out of life. And part of that was, well, here's how you define being a spiritual being. You know, growing up in a Baptist, very strict Baptist home, there was a script, and you go by that script, and here's when you get married. You're going to have kids at this time. You're going to, be a deacon in the church, perhaps a minister, and I was like, that is really not what I want. And I don't think it's hard for me to articulate just how strong of a fight that was. I remember crying, like taking a class on Joseph Campbell as an undergraduate, and I had never heard these ideas. The idea that Christianity was one myth of many myths blew my mind. And I would go to the teacher after class and say, "Is this true? Are you?" And I'm a 21, 22-year-old person at this point. But I was reduced to being a small child. I was like really grasping for something that I felt like, well, if that's that way, then what else is
right? Like, it
like
blew it
different?
all apart.
Yeah, it really was something. So that's when, all of the blocks fell, and I started kind of picking things back up that to build my sense of reality again. At that point. And luckily I was at a school where the professorship they were just really amazing. They weren't pushy, but at the same time they had an investment in their own ways in spiritual, or I'll use someone's term from today, totemic expression. And I ran with it, and it was an amazing time of growth for me. Like, it's the first time I looked at film as art. I just thought movies were something that you went to entertain yourself. And then it was Peter Greenaway's, oh my God, Prospero's books that I saw in some class, and I was like, this is like a moving painting, and it's so strange, and it feels important, but I don't know why. And then I saw Pulp Fiction, and I thought, wow, this guy took the front of the movie and put it in the middle, and then he put the back of the movie in the front, and it's like, but it still holds together. There's some fractured sense of truth that's in this thing, and he loves pop culture too, and he's putting it all together in his own soup. And I thought, okay, I want to do that. And and then I'm starting to look at graphic novels and comics that were doing the same thing. I credit Raw magazine with being, an alternative source of education for me. So at that point, I'm looking at Gary Panter, I'm looking at Chris Ware, I'm looking at, a number of artists that were, playing with form, playing with their own pasts, and kind of reformulating those into something that was usable. And I thought, well, if they can do it, then this is my community. I found my community. And it's like this idea of looking back. It's like, okay, I've saved all my drawings from when I was a childhood. I've protected all of those things in bags. And so I went home and got them out of the closet and start poring over all of these drawings from when I was 3 all the way up through high school. And I'm just mining it for something that I could use. And then I find my Torpedo Boy drawings from when I was 10 years old. And I say, okay, that's a truth. So I'm going to take that and run with that. I remembered, yes, like Wassan said, crawling around the house as a 3-year-old, 3-year-old, unscrewing the plastic tops from the detergents and cleansers, and playing with those brightly colored plastic tops with my toys. And as modules, those made so much sense. It's like, yeah, there's a body relationship where I'm huge and they're small, but my imagination makes them into little cities, and I can do that. And so there's this kind of back and forth that felt right. So I start doing performances and putting those plastic tops in my paintings, because in essence, they're an extension of the plastic that is the acrylic paint. So it's like this way to talk about mass production, but also on my own terms. It's like, here are these things that are beautifully milled and made, and they have a purpose, and some of them have logos on them. So when you're invited into the painting, you see evidence of my making, but you also see this kind of cultural output and this other type of usage, which, in the spirit of the found object, that also made sense. So I was able to kind of test my understanding of abstraction, my understanding of, the found object, and also just the will of pushing forth these images of my own creation.
And Torpedo Boy is one of those drawings, right? One that you kind of resurrected.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, Torpedo Boy was, at that point, I felt, and this is the time of Beavis and Butthead and Ren and Stimpy and all these types of anti-forms of entertainment, anti-heroes, and it's like, okay, there's an abjection that is sort of the new base of entertainment for not just young kids, but young adults. And this is getting broadcast and becoming, a widely accepted way of thinking. It's like it's Generation X, it's the way you market to people. So there's this, and I was born into that. This is the way I was thinking. So Torpedo Boy no longer was this superhero who showed up and saved the day on time and did everything correctly. He was very flawed, and that was so much more interesting to me, because then I could chip away at this idea of the Christ figure as a perfection, or this something that you shoot for. It's like, what is a hero? And if our understanding of perfection is limited by our own body and the fact that we're always degrading, and there's no, this idea of perfection it's a utopian myth. I understood that, and I wanted a character that I didn't necessarily want to behave like him, but it was nice to be able to test the waters and say, well, the artist ego is sort of played out through this superhero. He's super strength, super speed, but yet he's always stumbling and falling, and that was a really fun thing.
Should we tell the core story of the Mound Verse?
Sure. So, yeah, I'll just go into story time a little bit. So 50,000 years ago, there was
I can try, but I always mess up all the names.
No,
but I wrote them all down.
No, you've done very well. I'm super impressed. So, yeah, 50,000 years ago, there was an ape man named Homer Buctus. And he wasn't the smartest ape man that ever lived, but he did love his family, and he went out every week or whatever and collected food for his family. He had an ape wife named Almacroin and 2 ape children named Bruthuscam and Chromalina. And so one day he goes out and he finds this field of flowers, and it's this magical field of prehistoric flowers of shapes and sizes and colors that he's never seen before. You know, it's really hard for him to take it all in. And the only thing he knows to do to express his joy and excitement and perhaps confusion is he masturbates in this field of flowers. And his seed mixes with the flowers, and he leaves and returns the next day, and what he notices is that there are these new hybrid creatures that are half human and half plant, and these are the mounds. So those little creatures are sort of beckoning for his care and his love, and the flowers speak to Homer Buctus, and they say, Homer Buctus, we love you, and we want you to be a loving and caring father to all of your new mound babies. And he begins to spend more time in the field, creating more mounds, grooming them, and he's, spending a disproportionate time with them instead of his family. And they start to worry. They're like, where is he going every day? And eventually they find out that the 2 ape children, Bruthuscam and Chromalina, they become very jealous and hurt, and of course they would, because this is their daddy. And they go out there and they pick up tree branches and they start clobbering these little baby mounds over their head and kicking them and choking them. And there's this intense hatred and confusion that marks this time, which I call the Great Mound Massacre. And mounds, they're half plants, so they're rooted in the earth, and they can't get up and run away. But what they can do is they wobble back and forth. And thousands of these baby mounds wobbling in fear creates an earthquake, and the earth splits open and swallows up Bruthuscam and Chromalina, and a curse is set up on them, and they are banished to the lower realm, where they are to live the rest of their days. And when they're down there, they procreate, and they create an inbred race of creatures who they indoctrinate and say, you are to hate mounds. You are to hate everything that they stand for, which is love, and they're filled with meat, and you are to hate all of this. And you are to go back on top of the earth and destroy any of these remaining living mounds. And this race of mutated beings were the vegans. So this is the origin story and that kind of opposition that is set up very early on in what I call sort of my Genesis or Garden of Eden story. But there's 2 beings that are divine beings, Painter and Lloyd. Mm-hmm. Painter and Lloyd were actually one being at one point that did not have a name. They just were. But when the mounds were created and the earth split open, it caused a rift in the heavens, and it split this being open, and then we have the female half and this male half. We have Painter mm-hmm. and Lloyd. And Painter she's a spirit being that is the reason we can see color within the Moundverse. and Lloyd is the reason that we can read text, and everything is very black and white. He's a very stern character. They're both considered by me to be positive energies, but it manifests in a very different way. One's more aggressive, other is more kind of nurturing. And they create Torpedo Boy as their son that they send down to Earth to protect these mounds from these vegans. It was recently revealed to me that Torpedo Boy is the name of a spirit that inhabits a physical form. So when that physical form dies, his spirit just goes to the next being. I just happen to be the being right now that is Torpedo Boy. I have my own autonomy as Trenton Doyle Hancock, but when he takes over, his consciousness sort of takes over and drives my body. So I really don't have much control over what he does. And his name given to him by his actual parents is Boo Erlanius. And that's, I picked Boo because one of my grandmothers used to call me Boo for some reason when I was really little. I never knew why, never asked her either, and she's gone. But it was just the strangest thing. I answered to it, and I'm like, okay, I'm Boo when I go visit her. But so I thought, and all of the characters' names have sort of a very personal relationship. It's either anagrams of names of people I know, or just, yeah, there's some direct personal sort of relationship. So all of the stories that you hear me talking about, it probably has happened or will happen in my life at some point.
And I think what's so great is that in each kind of body of work you produce, it's sort of either pushing the story forward, the creation of new characters, or it's looking back, so what happened before. And so it's almost as if it's going to keep going on forever. I mean, there's so many. And I loved the way that you had said, I think to me the other day, that, it's as you're working through different thoughts that you realize a certain character needs to be created or enter into the story, right. Which I think is really interesting. Before we turn it to the audience for questions and conversation, I feel like we should talk just for a few minutes about this stunning work that we're sitting in front of. It would feel wrong not to. In 2008, Ballet Austin, well, before that, so probably a couple years before 2008, the director, Stephen Mills at Ballet Austin, invited you to think about kind of bringing the Moundverse alive by creating a ballet. And this is what we're sitting in front of is the set, the backdrop, for one of the backdrops for the ballet. And this is the first time it's being shown in the context of a museum space and not in the theater, which is really, really exciting for us to be able to share that with all of you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like to kind of bring the whole Moundverse? I mean, you designed all the costumes. You worked with a composer to create music. So what was that experience like, kind of taking it from the 2D, or you also do 3D, but taking it into a kind of different space?
Yeah. Well, it was welcome. Like, to get that call was very exciting. I was actually approached by an opera at the same time to do, which I actually think was here. Yeah, it was actually here in St. Louis. And I came, I remember I did a site visit, and I think it was a production that was already established, and they wanted me to do the sets and things for that. And I was like, okay, I think this might be something that I would want to do. I definitely want to move out of the gallery space and do something adventurous that is kind of out of my realm of understanding, to stretch myself, stretch my muscles a bit. And there's also a great history of artists working with theater, and I wanted to be part of that. And weirdly, just out of the blue, like a month later, when I was still sort of making the decision to work with the opera, Ballet Austin gave me the call and said, well, we want you to work with the ballet, and we want it to be your material as opposed to someone else's. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about opera or ballet, but the opportunity for me to express myself in its totality is much more inviting. So I went with Ballet Austin and saw a few of Stephen's productions because I was apprehensive at first. I was like, oh, this could be very scary. I don't know vegans and leotards. It doesn't make much sense to me right now. But after seeing some of his work, and he did a piece on the Holocaust, and there was some other kind of tougher material that he was dealing with, I thought, well, this is the person I want to work with, because he's also, thinking about how to tackle these very big things and say something important. And we teamed up, and quickly we brought on a composer, Graham Reynolds, who had worked in theater and also film. He's worked extensively with Richard Linklater to score some of his films in Austin and amongst others. So yeah, we built a pretty great team. We worked with my script, and then I was able to work with the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia to create this backdrop, which I guess it's 60 feet.
Which you sewed all yourself.
Yes, of course, I sewed it all myself. No, I can't sew at all. I can't even patch up my own socks. But there were amazing artists and artisans there that I was able to work with and learn from, and this piece got made, and the ballet, it was a interesting experience in the sense of it took 3 years to produce, and I was there every step of the way. I saw all the components, I constructed some of the props and things like that, saw the dancers rehearsing there and everything. But until you see all those things come together with the lighting, with the music and everything, you're sitting at your vantage point in the audience, and those curtains go up, you just have no idea what you're going to see. It was this magical thing that I didn't actually know how to take at first. They performed it 11 times, and I saw probably 6 or 7 of those performances. The first performance, I was just stunned. I didn't know what I saw. I didn't know if I liked it or hated it. I didn't know what it was. By the third time I saw it, I was like, this is really interesting. I think I really like this. And by the 6th time, I was in love with it. But it was this interesting thing where it truly was outside of me. It was a very special kind of feeling and experience, because it was the sum total of the 3 of us that made this thing. And not just the 3 of us, there were so many other people that were part of this production. So it must be sort of a truncated, maybe feeling of what a filmmaker must feel. Like there's so many cooks in the kitchen to make. I'm surprised when any kind of film gets made. There's just so many moving parts, and the ballet was no different. And it's been long enough that I feel like I want to jump back in and do something with another, in maybe some other form of theater. But that was such a big experience, and really kick-started me into thinking about, what other ways can my practice branch out? That was sort of a big thing that helped me understand scale in my practice in a very, very different way. Because I thought I made big paintings, and then I saw this, and I was like, oh my God, the things I'm making in my studio they could be so much bigger. So that's when I started making larger things and expanding my idea of scale.
I just want to share that if you're interested in getting a sneak peek of the ballet, we are thankful to Ballet Austin that they've given us the permission to show it. So it's looping upstairs in our library, so you can listen. It's not as good as being there, I'm sure, but you can get a sense of what the costumes and the music and everything are like. I think this is a good moment for us to kind of turn it to the audience. And so if you have any questions, raise your hand. Please wait for the microphone because we're recording. And I just ask that you please make it, form your comment into a question so that we can have a good conversation.
And Candace is going to take this side of the room, and I'm going to take this other one.
Great.
Hi, Trent. You also worked with Island Press, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday, but I found it interesting what you said about working in St. Louis then and now. Can you talk about that experience?
Sure. Yeah, I think it was in 2012. I was here, invited by Island Press, and that was a really great experience. We worked for a week and made a really fun, and then for me, very important set of images that used every print process you could imagine into these. I think it was either 16 or 20 different images. And it was a time in my practice where I wanted to kind of start over. I was looking for this new jumping off point, which was my grandmother's home. So that whole series of work was about her, this house in Paris, Texas, that I spent pretty much half my childhood going to, and we spent all of holidays hanging out there, and it was a gathering point. It was the epicenter, for our family. And there's textures, there's textiles, there's wallpaper, and different sounds that you would hear in the house, different types of poetry, things that, platitudes and things that she would talk about that were repeated and became synonymous with home and with stability and with, just warmth. And I wanted to, dedicate a series of work to her and to this idea of, going home. And that's when I first started using the tile pattern that you'll see in the paintings. And it's called a quatrefoil pattern, which I learned more recently what it was called. I just thought it was the stuff on my grandmother's floor, which was considered at the time just kind of an ugly 70s floor linoleum tile. But I was reintroduced to that tile, and I was looking for literally a new ground to stand on in my practice. I'd been in the forest, I'd been in the caves, and various other places, in alleyways and in other kinds of archetypal spaces, and never really focused on the interiors, the domestic interiors of my childhood. So that this was a great opportunity for me to kind of go back and mine my memory for all of those things and figure out what was important. I mean, I learned how to draw laying on that floor, and I would look up and my grandmother would be sitting on the couch making quilts. So there's this, and I would think, oh yeah, we're a team. I'm drawing down here and she's up there doing her thing. And there was this sense of connection, this umbilical connection to these patterns and textiles. And that was through the prints that I was able to do, at Island Press, articulated and kind of set the stage for actually where I am now. I mean, that was a very distilled version of what I'm doing now. So it's great to come back to St. Louis in this capacity, and this is also a show about reflection, and it's about looking back and seeing the connectivity between paintings from '97 all the way to 2017. So I think there's something there.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So through this talk, you've mentioned like the influence of comic books have been like how you've gotten into art. Do you think of any characters or series in particular that made an impression on you as a kid that have influenced you today?
Right. Yeah, there was I remember getting the first comic I ever received. I mean, just as a kid, I knew, you know, comic characters were just omnipresent, like the Incredible Hulk or Spider-Man. Like, kind of everyone knew these characters. But the first comic I ever received was when I think I was 10 years old, and I was getting my tonsils out, and my stepdad brought me. I remember he brought me a GoBot, and he brought me a stack of comics in the hospital, and I still have those. I still have them all, and it was. One of them was a Spider-Man comic that had him fighting a character who didn't show up afterwards a lot. It was like a one-off almost. His name was Spot, and he looked like Spider-Man, but like a Dalmatian. And he could take these black spots off of himself and place them in the air, and then go through them like they were like a warp, and he could end up in other places. And it was hard for Spider-Man to figure out where he was going because there was just all these dots in the air. So I just thought that was such a cool concept, and also visually, the way it played out in the comic, I thought was pretty cool. The comics for me, it was, some people key in on the writing. I never was one of those kids. It was always about, is it drawn well? Like, is it cool to look at? Mm-hmm. And I think I quickly developed this sense of, well, this is a bad artist, and this is a really cool artist over here. So I was real interested in design, mm-hmm. and those people that I thought were hacks, and then people that were just really moving the craft forward. And by the time I got to high school, it was just so much about, oh my God, that's an artist that I want to be like. And then I really started to try and, retrace, not trace, but figure out how I could get that energy. One of those artists was Kent Williams, who did a comic called Havoc and Wolverine Meltdown. And that was, it's Marvel characters, but it was put out by this branch of Marvel called Epic. And Epic was what did more adult-themed comics. So characters, they actually had sex and killed one another and did things that they kind of edited out of the more mainstream comics. So I was like, okay, this is for me. And some of those comics were actually painted. So all the panels, instead of being drawn, were painted. And this was Kent Williams and John Muth. So it was two different artists. And Kent Williams painted the Wolverine parts, and Muth painted the Havoc parts. And the Havoc character was more sensitive. He's like a sensitive guy. And those were kind of a nice kind of gouache and watercolory look. And the panels that had Wolverine in them were very rough and tumble and more brutish, and like you could see the underdrawing and the lines. And I thought, oh my God, that's so great. Two really great forms of painting in one book. And that kind of, oh my God, okay, this is going somewhere else. The idea of the anthology was really interesting to me back then. So I'd pick up Heavy Metal magazine when I go to the store, and I'd thumb through it. And of course, there's stories by probably 6 or 7 different artists in those types of books. But in my head, I just put them all together as one artist. And that idea that, well, I have to learn how to draw this way, I have to learn to draw this way and this way if I want it to be a full packaged thing, was ingrained in me quite early, like this idea of being an anthological type of an artist and have a hand that has the dexterity and diversity that could carry that forward in a way that's believable. So that was always a challenge for me, is I want to be able to draw with, brutishly. I want to be able to draw with a sensitivity and just everything in between. And that still keeps me going. That's a very exciting thing for me. Which brings me to comics now. There's not a lot of diversity in comics in the kinds of lines. There's a very homogeneous kind of flat aspect to them. I just think comics were so much richer back in the day.
In your own words, what is the difference between painting and illustration, and how did you know you wanted to be a painter?
I don't know that sometimes there's not a distinction, but it depends on the context, really. There's some great illustrations that I'm like, that's a really great painting. And then some paintings I see that I'm like, wow, that could be a really great illustration for this point. So I think it always goes back and forth for me. But in terms of my own practice, when I first started as an undergraduate, making that transition from saying, okay, I don't think I want to do the Marvel comic thing right now, maybe I'll be an illustrator, or I'll be in the graphic arts world. And this is in the early 90s. Everything wasn't on computer yet. It was still more cut and paste. But I remember going to a design conference, and I was just bombarded with this idea of deadlines and structure and strictures. And I thought, this isn't the world for me. So I think in some ways it was just a difference in, well, I thought that some of the artisans that were working as designers were amazing, like draftspeople, like they could really like they had a tremendous control and command over just design concepts, which I've always thought that's super important. Be able to draw. So many fucking kids now don't know how to draw. But so that I was impressed by everybody. The thing I wasn't so impressed by was everyone was just so concerned about having nothing falling over the edges and it being so clean, and I was like, well, that's definitely not me. Maybe this world isn't for me. So I'm glad I realized early on. I started taking more fine art classes, taking more painting courses, and the things that were not celebrated in the design departments were celebrated in the painting departments. So but at the same time, and maybe this was just me, I was like, well, if this painting thing doesn't work out, I want to be able to go and be a designer. I want to be able to go and make some illustrations, but I don't want to take these courses with these people. So I was always practicing behind the scenes, like how can I? And I was throughout my whole college years, I was the cartoonist for the school newspaper. So I guess I was keeping up those chops of staying in the lines and being an illustrator, because I was also, the illustrator for all those papers. So there were these two things I was always kind of dealing with, and ultimately, as you see now, it's all one form, and I'm kind of nurturing all of that at the same time.
And I think what's so interesting is there's such a fluidity in the material you use. And for most of you out here who haven't had the opportunity to visit Trenton's studio, it's like when you go into a studio, you're like, oh, okay, I think I get it now. Because you go in and there are scraps of fabric and felt and piles of different plastic and your multitude of toy collections and paintings you collect from thrift stores, and it's this whole environment that, and you've talked about the studio floor being a kind of space that you have inspiration, or you might find a piece and kind of it finds its place on a work that you're making. And so this kind of fluidity of all the different materials, it feels so natural when you go into your studio, because all these things kind of coexist in that space with you.
It feels natural and a little criminal sometimes. I'm like, this is too easy. I shouldn't be able to, have this much fun. So yeah, I'm like, they'll figure it out one day, and then they'll write me out of this whole thing.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You mentioned a couple times in the discussion the influence of the teachers helping you to ask questions, developing your own language as an artist. What's your role with teaching now? Do you teach, run workshops? How do you?
Right. I've never been connected in a to any one university. I do travel around a lot. I'm invited to do lectures and meet with students a lot. So I've been doing that for whatever the past almost 20 years. But this next, in about a month, I will be teaching more of a kind of a course at University Texas Austin, just for the semester. But yeah, I'm curious to see how that goes. I mean, I do like that atmosphere, and I love meeting with and really learning from the students, because you see in undergrads and graduates generally are quite different in the sense that undergraduates, they haven't learned any of the rules yet, or at least they're still in the process of learning how to kind of get those frayed edges off of there. So I think there's a lot more adventurous things to kind of see and sometimes mine from the students there. Grad students it's really great because you see that they're really starting to think about how to move into the big, scary art world, and to really figure out how to write their own path and make their own rules amongst a community that has its own rules. So to really develop that tough skin and go out there and do it. And I find both spaces admirable, and I remember both those spaces for myself, and it's really, I think, a joy to, at least in the way that I've been with my career, to audit in some ways academia and be part of it on my own terms. But yeah, I could see one day having a little bit more of a fixed relationship with it.
All right, I think we can do one more question. Okay, we'll try to do a few more, but I know everyone's let's go here in the front.
What's going to happen with the action figures?
These guys, thank you for the question. These are prototypes here, so they're not really put together in the way that I want them to be, but you get a sense of these two. Here we have Torpedo Boy, and this is Joe. This is Vegan Joe. And he, I don't know if he's going to be friends with Torpedo Boy or whether they're enemies. I can't tell at this point. But whoever ends up with them can make that call. But this is a short run of figures that I'm doing. The arms and legs will be glued together, so they're more statue action figure, staction figure, if you will. But it'll be a short run of about 30 each, or 25 each, and those will be available on my website hopefully within the next month or so. I'm still trying to work out the packaging and stuff for them, but I thought I would bring them just so you guys know that this is something I'm kind of embarking on. In the show, there's the Mound doll, who is also a short run, in a way to test the waters to see if, I could get the kind of production that I want out of a toy. And that thing is sort of in between an art object and a toy. It's still, but I want everyone to be able to have these things in the way that you can have this Garbage Pail Kid, and I'm working on a comic right now. Still talking to Fantagraphics about it, but it's going to be a 400-page epic at the end of the day. Just kind of retelling the Mound Verse tale, part of my autobiography in it. But yeah, I'm anxious to move not away from the art world, but kind of move into the Comic-Con world. That's a whole other kind of ecosystem that I'm very interested in and affected by. And as you can see here on the screen, these are some figures which will be, I think they're 14 or 15-inch tall dolls that will be shown in Philadelphia at my alma mater, Tyler School of Art. And I was invited back to do this program where I work with one of the recent graduate students. I worked with a guy named Tim Ruster-Holtz, who's an amazing sculptor, and we've been, collaboratively putting together these designs. I'll be flying to LA tonight and in a few days, seeing these prototypes in person in LA to give give them the okay on the prototypes to go ahead and move forward with production and shipping on those. So that's kind of exciting. And yeah, there's various other things, and all this is sort of barreling towards a show that I'll be doing at Mass Mocha in 2019, which will be sort of what I'm calling a trade fair or a theme park almost for the Mound. Fun house, a fun house for the Moundverse, which will have giant structures and characters that you can, take selfies with if you want, or mounds that you can actually open up and go inside. And I'll be recreating my toy museum there, which I'm a huge toy collector, so I'll have, hundreds and hundreds of my toys that I've collected over the years displayed there. So it'll be this kind of immersive environment, but these things like this, these cards, these toys, and comics, and those types of things, that's a very important aspect of the practice right now, and I'm just trying to get all of that stuff up to speed where when people think of me, they don't just say, oh, he's the painter that makes that other stuff. I want it all to be equal. So that's why I've been fighting. I've been fighting pretty hard the past few years. My gallerists know this stuff. They're like, what is he doing? I'm like, I want to make toys. I'm like, but you're a painter.
Well, I think this might be a good wrap-up point, and I'll just reiterate that we're really excited that Trenton created one of the Garbage Pail Kid cards that this is the fourth one, right? That
This
you've
is the
made?
fourth
Yeah.
one, yeah.
So this is the fourth one, and this one is specific to this show here at CAM. And so we're excited to be able to have them so that everyone can take a little piece of Trenton home with them for $3, which is really exciting. And I just want to end with thanking you all for coming here today, and a huge thank you to you, Trenton, for spending all of the time and your energy and sharing your world with me and with everybody here at CAM and in St. Louis. Thank you.
Thank you.